Hey, I just want to make this quick video to demonstrate yet another reason why RFK Jr. is unfit to serve as head of HHS. So yesterday at his first confirmation hearing, he was asked whether or not he has ever said that COVID is a bioweapon that is racially targeted against certain races.
So I'm asking you yes or no, Mr. Kennedy. Did you say that COVID-19 was a genetically engineered bioweapon that targets black and white people, but spared Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese people?
I didn't say it was deliberately targeted. I just quoted an NIH-funded and NIH published study.
This is an absolutely ridiculous idea, but here's the clip of him making an argument that this is an idea that makes sense.
COVID-19, there's an argument that it is ethnically targeted. COVID-19 attacked certain races disproportionately. The races that are most immune to COVID-19 are because of the structure of the genetic structure or different genetic differentials among different races of the receptors of the ACE2 receptor. COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasians and black people. The people who are most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese. But we don't know whether it was deliberately targeted that or not. But there are papers out there that show the racial and ethnic differential and impact to that.
Like I said, this is an absolutely ridiculous idea. This is not true in the slightest. So where is he getting this idea? He's getting it from this paper that was published early in the pandemic in 2020. It's called New Insights into Genetic Susceptibility of COVID-19 and ACE2 and TMPRSS2 Polymorphism Analysis. So essentially what these researchers did was they looked at the genomes of 81,000 humans and tried to determine whether or not their genes code for receptors that SARS-CoV-2 might bind to more readily than other people. This was a completely in silico-based study, meaning it was all done in a computer model. So in other words, the researchers just use a computer model to guess whether or not humans with specific mutations in the receptors that SARS-CoV-2 uses to enter cells would bind SARS-CoV-2 better than others. And their computer model did identify mutations that the computer model thought would bind SARS-CoV-2 more readily than others. And they found that these mutations cluster mostly around African people and non-Finnish Europeans. Meanwhile, these mutations were found to not be present in those of Ashkenazi Jewish descent or the Amish community, as well as South Asian and Latino populations. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr., someone who claims to be very good at reading and interpreting scientific data, which would be an absolutely essential skill for a head of an HHS to have, saw this paper and said that COVID is a bioweapon used to target black people and people of non-Finnish European descent. This shows that he is incompetent and not fit to serve as head of HHS. It's one of many things that show that. But in this case, someone who is actually good at reading scientific literature and is careful about reading and interpreting the data would see this paper and immediately acknowledge that it is a computer model-based study. This is typically an early phase study that biologists will often do in order to inform downstream experiments. So they might do a computer model-based experiment that could inform experiments that could be done in a lab or in the clinic in order to narrow down a window of where they want to search for answers, so to speak. For example, if we wanted to do something like design a drug to specifically bind an enzyme that might be unique to a person's cancer, we could use a computer model to design a theoretical drug that could bind that particular enzyme. And then scientists could try that prediction in the lab to see if it works, rather than just starting pretty much blind and trying a whole array of options that have a low likelihood of working. But the absolutely crucial part is doing those laboratory or clinical experiments to actually see if the computer model got anything right. So someone reading this paper alone would have extreme caution in their interpretation. That's why the authors themselves wrote in the paper, quote, "This comprehensive comparative genetic analysis of approximately 81,000 human genomes suggested possible associations of ACE2 and TMPRSS2 DNA polymorphisms with COVID-19 susceptibility, severity, and clinical outcomes." Especially in this context, this is science speak for our data might mean something, but we really don't know. It's also important to point out that these mutations that these authors did identify with this computer program were present in about 0.01% of the population. So these mutations are not only extremely rare, but they had no evidence to suggest that they actually translate to any clinical outcomes when it comes to different races. But that didn't stop Robert F. Kennedy Jr. from treating this paper like it was reason to believe that COVID was a bioweapon. Someone who is good at reading scientific literature and careful in interpreting the results would also look for other papers to see, were these results vindicated anywhere but this computer model? And this clip surfaced in 2023, so he probably had enough time to read this paper, Human ACE2 Receptor Polymorphisms and Altered Susceptibility to SARS-CoV-2. The researchers in this paper did similar work to the last paper, but they also included some laboratory-based experiments in order to supplement and test the model that their computers were generating. Their results found that any mutations that they identified that might increase susceptibility to SARS-CoV-2 were extremely rare and were not clustered among certain populations of humans. So this study is directly rejecting the idea that COVID is a bioweapon targeted at specific races. Yet Kennedy did not seem to read or even acknowledge this paper in any of what he has said about COVID being a supposed bioweapon against certain races. And yet more studies done even after that have further shown that any racial disparities in clinical outcomes of COVID-19 were due almost entirely to structural differences in social and economic inequities, including but not limited to access to quality healthcare. Someone who is careful in reading and interpreting scientific literature before they communicate it to the public, which would be very important in a leadership position, would have read these papers and have immediately recognized that COVID is not a bioweapon and would not have pushed the idea that it is one specifically targeted at specific races. But that's not who Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is. He is incompetent. He has no experience reading and correctly interpreting scientific literature. He sees something that supports a preconceived agenda or preconceived notion, and he immediately runs with it without any regard to what the truth is or what the data actually say. That is one of the many reasons why he is unfit to serve as head of HHS. And it's also why, if he does get confirmed, we are in for a long 4 years and a decline in American public health. Oh, and one more thing that just really annoys me. He said that this was an NIH study. No, it was not an NIH study. It was funded with a grant given out by the NIH, but that's not what an NIH study is. The NIH has its own labs that produce its own work and its own studies. That's an NIH study. This was a study coming from scientists collaborating from places like the Cleveland Clinic, Columbia University, and Case Western. This is a basic misunderstanding that I see a lot of people who have no clue how to read scientific literature make, and it just shows again that Kennedy has no idea how to read and interpret scientific literature. Sorry, that's just another petty little thing I have to point out. So yeah, that's going to be it for this video. I'm going to try to do a live stream this Saturday afternoon so that I can answer questions and address comments from people who support RFK Jr. or hear from people who are looking to inform people. So it should be a fun stream. Call in if you want. There will be information in the post coming later this week about that. I'll see you in the next video, and good luck to us all.